Mr. Roule, thank you so much for being with us today. At the time of recording this interview, Iran and US are supposed to have a negotiation in Oman in coming days. And given to that, can you give us a brief recap? In your view, what are primary objectives that each side are bringing to this table and negotiation?
It's an excellent question. The Trump administration wishes to avoid a reconstitution of the 2015 nuclear agreement. It saw that agreement had some fundamental flaws. First, the agreement placed reversible and temporary restrictions on Iran's nuclear enterprise, but provided permanent and long-term financial relief for the Islamic Republic, which the Islamic Republic used to finance militias and terrorism around the world. So the Trump administration seeks permanent restrictions on Iran's nuclear enterprise, one that allows it to maintain a civilian nuclear program, but not the capacity for a nuclear weapon. At the same time, not to provide sanctions relief that the Quds Force could then use to reconstitute the militias and terrorist groups in the region that have been decimated over the last year. This is going to be complicated because at the same time, Iran seeks the opposite. Iran will seek to constrain the talks to avoid discussions of missiles, regional activity, hostages. It will seek to focus on reversible, finite constraints on its nuclear program. It will seek to have extensive talks, whereas the United States will have short-term talks to avoid lengthy discussions. I think the first talks are really more of a sense of where understand how each side is approaching the discussions, less what each side is seeking to get out of the discussions.
As you mentioned about the time, as we all know, Iran is the master of strategic delay, dragging out the negotiation while they are advancing their nuclear program. But the situation is for US totally different, right? As Morgan Ortagus mentioned in her latest interview with Al Arabiya, how the Trump administration are able to avoiding to falling in the trap of Iran in a sense of time as the Biden administration did?
Well, first, it wasn't just the Biden administration that fell into the trap of extensive talks. Certainly, the Biden administration did have extensive negotiations with the Islamic Republic, but so did multiple European governments. So did the Obama administration in 2013 through to 2015. But also the Europeans had similar lengthy discussions between 2003 and 2005. Now, in part, once you engage in nuclear discussions that aim only to constrain a program, these are inherently complicated. And the Islamic Republic tends to negotiate, and then to negotiate on that which it negotiated, as I often put it. So the discussions tend to be complicated. And if you involve multiple parties, the parties then negotiate amongst themselves as to what they're actually talking about. So they inherently become very complicated. The Trump administration is not involving multiple parties in the talks. So it's avoiding the multi-party discussions that would delay the talks. At the same time, the Trump administration is not interested in discussions that would allow Iran to diffuse the military pressure, to limit the sanctions pressure, to fragment any coalitions the Trump administration may seek to build. The Trump administration is also facing a very different time in Iran's history. If you look at the last 20 years, Iran has approached nuclear negotiations only when it has faced significant military pressure. It approached these negotiations in 2003 after facing the presence of primarily US but coalition forces in Iraq and Afghanistan in 2002. First, it turned off its Ahmad nuclear weaponization program, and then to prevent military action and to diffuse international sanctions, it undertook the European negotiations in which the United States unsuccessfully sought involvement between 2003 and 2005. In 2012, we had significant military tensions in the Middle East. The United States had placed 3 aircraft carrier task forces in the region. There were concerns over a military conflict erupting in the Persian Gulf. There were significant regional tensions because of events in Syria. And we thought the possibility of military action on Iran's nuclear program expansion was a likelihood. Again, Iran approached those talks with the idea of nuclear concessions and then turned these into lengthy discussions that reduce the possibility of military action and again reduce the sanctions pressure. But now is different. It's different for several reasons. First, the Iranian government is facing an unprecedented period of political, economic, and security pressure. And I need to unpack that a little bit because this is a unique time in the history of the Islamic Republic. It's certainly an unprecedented time for Tehran since perhaps 1988. In the last year, the Islamic Republic has seen the death of former President Ebrahim Raisi, perhaps the only individual capable of replacing the supreme leader with the same ideological paradigms and the same pedigree of official positions that would allow him to continue the direction of the Islamic Republic for another generation, fitting with the perspective of the supreme leader. There is no follow-on candidate capable of sustaining the Islamic Republic in the direction the supreme leader would hope. We've seen President Pezeshkian have a very, very poor election turnout. And the Islamic Republic once prided itself on its election turnout, and it was embarrassing. He's seen the loss of Vice President Zarif. He's seen the loss of another vice president who took a rather expensive vacation. He's seen a finance minister lose his job, and the finance minister departing, discussing how many Iranians had fallen into poverty in the last decade. But that's the political impotence of the government. Economically, the situation is even worse. We've watched not only the increasing poverty of the Iranian people, where perhaps as many as 30% of the population is in poverty. We've watched 35% inflation. We've watched the Iranian rial, which was once about 72 rials to the dollar at the time of the 1979 revolution, plummet to over $1 million to a dollar today. Now, to put that into perspective, in the United Arab Emirates, their dirham was about 3.8 to the dollar in 1979. Today, it's about 3.76 to the dollar. It's practically unchanged. So you're seeing what two different governments can do to their currency over the period of an identical time frame. We're also watching the energy crisis within Iran. So we watched earlier this year because of a lack of natural gas, electricity, schools were closed, government offices, companies were closed. We're watching drought, and the drought has yet to begin for 2025. And we're watching further promise of energy problems in Iran, where the government has announced that it's unlikely to be able to produce more than a third of the electricity requirements in 2025 and 2026. This is an economic catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. And finally, we have the security catastrophe for Iran. Now, we have the Israeli military strikes, which demonstrated the impotence of Iran's strategic air defenses. In 2016, when Iran acquired its S-300 air defense systems, it bragged to the region that it was invulnerable. And now we see that that is untrue. And in fact, there really aren't any other air defense systems available to Iran from Russia or China, which could compete with the US military technology that Israel possesses, let alone that America possesses. You also have the failure of Iran's ballistic missile launches against Israel, which were an embarrassing defeat for the Islamic Republic. And last, of course, you have the collapse of the ring of fire of its proxies, the deaths of Hassan Nasrallah, of Ismail Haniyeh, of Khalid Mishal, the loss of so many main players. For Iran, it has not faced such a situation since 1988. The survival of the Islamic Republic at a time when it is on the cusp of a transition to a post-revolutionary generation of leadership is an unprecedented crisis in its history. Is it time for the supreme leader to drink a cup of poison, as did his predecessor? And think about giving up industrial enrichment. Think about giving up militia building in order to normalize the behavior of the Islamic Republic, to allow the Iranian people a lifestyle, a standard of living, an international engagement enjoyed by the Gulf Cooperation Council states such a short distance away from the Iranian people. And given that the Iranian people have such an extraordinary history and such an amazing pool of talent, aren't they deserving of such a lifestyle?
Since you mentioned about Iranian enrichment, I'm going to get back to your last week, I think, your testimony in the Congress regarding to Iranian nuclear program. You mentioned that Iran has stockpiled enough, 60% enriched uranium for at least 7 nuclear weapons. At the same time, in another room, Tulsi Gabbard called Iranian nuclear program as a peaceful program for United States. My question is, actually, what evidence or what intelligence U.S. United States assessment is based on that regarding to Iranian nuclear program, given to this conflicting idea, if we can call it this way?
Well, the ideas are actually consistent. So let's unpack this. The Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, presented in the annual threat assessment hearing the statement that had 3 parts regarding the Islamic Republic's nuclear program. First, that the U.S. intelligence community assesses that the Supreme Leader has not reauthorized the start of the Ahmad nuclear weapons program that he halted in 2003. This is the program that Iran denies to this day ever existing, but the U.S. intelligence community and other governments state that Iran had. The second part of the U.S. intelligence assessment, as presented by Director Gabbard, is that there is a rising wave of discussion in Iran that Iran should perhaps possess nuclear weapons, and that this discussion is starting to impact decision makers within Iran in that direction. And the third part of that assessment was that the status of Iran's nuclear program today is inconsistent with a peaceful program, and indeed doesn't look like a peaceful program anywhere on Earth. So there is not a weapons program, but what the nuclear program looks like does not look like a civilian program. My comments reflect the assessment not of myself, but of the International Atomic Energy Agency. So this is not a U.S. position. This is an international position. And this is important because the Islamic Republic will want to make this a U.S. versus Iran fight. And it's not that. This is the position of the International Atomic Energy Agency. And that position is as follows. Iran requires uranium enriched to 3 to 5% for its civilian nuclear program. Iran requires a centrifuge capacity to produce that enrichment. And Iran requires facilities to hold those types of centrifuges. Okay. Iran is now primarily producing 60% enriched uranium, for which it has no civilian purpose, none whatsoever. 60% enriched uranium, while not sufficient for a nuclear weapon, is actually military grade enrichment. It's exactly what a country would produce on the road to a nuclear weapon. Most of Iran's centrifuges are advanced centrifuges. They're the type of centrifuges you would use if you wanted to produce highly enriched uranium, weapons grade, very quickly. Also, advanced centrifuges require a smaller footprint. Why is that important? It means that the production sites can be smaller. They can be more easily hidden. They can be more easily buried in mountains. And indeed, much of Iran's 60% non-civilian grade enriched uranium is produced at a Fordow facility near Qom, which looks pretty much like what you would build if you were building a weapons-grade enrichment facility. Last, we have Iran's treatment of the International Atomic Energy Agency. Iran has repeatedly hampered IAEA access. Again, this is not me. Your listeners, your viewers can read about this online and look at this in International Atomic Energy Agency reports. Currently, Iran provides access to the International Atomic Energy Agency, in essence, showing what it is doing with its program that is far in excess of its civilian requirements. It's in essence normalizing its non-civilian enrichment program. At the same time, it's not providing access to parts of its program that would allow the International Atomic Energy Agency to show that this is not a military program. What do I mean by that? Iran produces equipment for its centrifuges. It is not providing the International Atomic Energy Agency with access to that production. So the International Atomic Energy Agency is unable to say, is Iran stockpiling this for a covert facility? Is it building a covert facility? So in essence, already the international community is losing confidence in its ability to understand whether Iran is building a covert program. So the two assessments between Director Gabbard, which in essence says Iran is not currently weaponizing, and the statements that I had and others have made that Iran is developing a program that is far beyond its civilian needs, but looks exactly like what a country would do if it were building a nuclear weapons program, are consistent. So let me sum this up. Iran is building a nuclear program that looks exactly like what a country would build if it were trying to develop a nuclear weapons program gradually, but did not want to make the last final steps for one of two reasons. First, it believed Western intelligence is so good, those steps would be discovered before it could complete those steps, and it would then face a crushing military attack for which it has no defense. Pretty good evidence that would happen. But there's a second option. The second option is that Iran believes that by gradually improving its military program, its a nuclear program, it builds diplomatic advantages that exceed the advantages it would have with an actual nuclear weapon. Once it has a weapon, it suddenly becomes a problem for Iran. But if it comes close to a weapon, it's able to turn to many countries and say, if you pressure me on the Quds force, if you pressure me on the oppression of my people, if you pressure me on shooting women in the street, if you pressure me on taking hostages, the hardliners in my country will make the final steps to a nuclear weapon. You should not pressure me. And that last point actually also sums up where the Iranian government has been for the last 20 years. It has used its nuclear program as a shield and its Quds force as a sword. And that nuclear program has been a shield by which the Revolutionary Guard, the hardliners, and others have oppressed the Iranian people and also have pushed out to create militias in the region.
I have a follow-up question on this. Given your more than 3 decades of service in CIA, if you were to map the trajectory of Iranian nuclear program over time, I'm asking about specific years or a specific detail about that, how would you characterize the key inflection point on that? Actually, my question is, where and what point exactly Iranians shifted from the civilian framework in nuclear program to the military? Do we have any specific year or any specific detail for that or no?
According to published information, around 2002, 2003, Iran moved to a nuclear weaponization program, the Ahmad program. run by a now deceased individual named Mohsen Fakhrizadeh. That program was discovered because of the large presence of US military forces. The Islamic Republic halted that program out of concern there would be a military attack. And the supreme leader made a vague statement about the possession of nuclear weapons. Later, President Hassan Rouhani was a nuclear negotiator at that time. And in 2012, he reportedly told an Iranian newspaper that in 2004, he had an idea that in negotiations with the Europeans, he would say that the supreme leader told him nuclear weapons were a bad thing. He just pulled this idea out of his head, and he created this idea of a fatwa. So we have had, and the idea of a fatwa is also important because it's often brought up by the Islamic Republic and by others in the West. And we have had since that time, and I believe on the Supreme Leader's own webpage, a series of statements regarding nuclear weapons. Most of those statements do not ban nuclear weapons. In fact, they could be interpreted to say that the development, research, even possession of nuclear weapons are acceptable. It's only the use, I believe, in a couple of statements that are deemed wrong. However, in 2021, the then head of Iran's intelligence service reportedly stated that there is a difference between a cat that is roaming and a cat that is cornered. It acts differently. People can change their opinions. And of course, religious fatwas can be changed to reflect circumstances. So Iran's positions on nuclear weapons have changed over the years. And you now have this discourse in Iran that its possession of nuclear weapons could change under pressure. I should also state that although Iran did accept and abide by the constraints of the 2015 nuclear deal, those constraints in 2029 would have essentially largely ended, to allow Iran to produce as much 90% enriched uranium it wished, to lift all missile bans, all conventional weapons bans, to allow Iran to produce advanced centrifuges and uranium metal. But also, Iran retained a cache of nuclear weapons-related documentation related to that 2003 weapons program. And here's why that's important. That cache of documentation, which the Israeli government then spirited out and presented to the world, is critically important because it demonstrates to the world that the Islamic Republic had a program led by now deceased Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, retained the option of nuclear weaponization as a policy for the future. And I think in the Trump administration and with many people in the West, it really fractured the idea of you could ever trust the Islamic Republic because they kept that material going.
In your recent interview with ILTV, you mentioned that while Israel could deliver a serious, profound, and consequential blow to Iran's nuclear program, it wouldn't necessarily stop it permanently. My question is, don't you believe any kind of unilateral strike to Iran that might even accelerate Iran to crossing to nuclear threshold, actually make them able to using this strike as a strategic justification, as Israel did with October 7? Isn't any concern for United States or Israel?
Well, I won't speak for the Trump administration leadership or the Israeli government, but I will talk about my statement. Based on the nature of the Israeli airstrike on Iran and the nature of Iran's nuclear facilities, it is reasonable to believe that Israel would be able to conduct a massive and consequential strike that would severely damage Iran's nuclear enterprise. Now, of course, that may not destroy all aspects of the program, all personnel, all knowledge, all capabilities. But if you're in the day after that, you have to ask the following questions. If you were an Iranian scientist, would you want to work in the subsequent program, seeing what happened to the predecessors? If you were the Iranian government, would you want to invest in a program that was destroyed the day before, knowing that you didn't have air defenses to protect it the next day? If you were the Iranian government, how long would it take you to reconstitute a program that you believe could survive a follow-on attack? If you were the Iranian government, how long do you think it would take you to build a program that you think could keep secret from an Israeli government that somehow is able to find your most secret nuclear cache? And according to press reports, Ismail Haniyeh's passing, the Iranian government has laid the passing of the death of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, a variety of other people at Israel's door. Do you think you could keep that secret from Israel? So if you can't keep it secret and you can't defend it, would you rebuild that the next day? And by the way, would you want to work there the next day? And if you were a family member of somebody, would you want your family member to work there the next day in that situation? Now, I'm not advocating violence. I'm not advocating war in any way. I'm advocating a diplomatic solution. But if you're asking the military question of what could Israel do, well, they demonstrated a military capacity, and Iran does not have a way to defeat that. And the day after has a logical series of consequences that need to be considered.
In your another interview with Peter Bergen, I think, you describe Iran as a serial arsonist, referring to the proxy war in the region. Given to all the significant shift in the regional dynamic in last year, how do you see Iran rebuild or recalibrate the future regional power alignment in the Middle East?
Well, the Quds forces suffered some significant leadership losses in the last few years, beginning, of course, with the killing of Qasem Soleimani. It lost a number of its senior officers in Syria in 2013, 2014. And of course, it lost a number of its officers in Syria in 2024, not just at the April attack by Israel at the building near the Iranian embassy, but reportedly in other attacks and accidents in Syria. But it's a large organization with elements responsible for Asia, Africa, the Gulf that are intact. Those elements continue to operate, they continue to plan, they continue to have their mission to build terrorist groups. The training camps in Iran remain operational and functional. The Hezbollah, Hamas, Houthi groups, Palestinian militant groups, of which there are a number, still exist. They're severely damaged. If you are Iran, your goals are to push diplomacy because you want to push these groups to survive. Because once they survive, you then want to find a way to reconstitute training in Iran. You want to reconstitute the identification and the nurturing of leadership within these groups to build a new generation of leadership, play the long game. You want to rebuild logistics lines. This will be difficult. They've lost the geography of Syria. There is reporting that Iran is attempting to reestablish itself in Syria. Syria remains a very dynamic environment as the new Syrian government attempts to assert its sovereignty, and Iran attempts to push back against that. But the Red Sea and the opportunity of access through Africa provides Iran with opportunities. So if Iran is able to establish a presence in Sudan, and Iran has attempted to acquire a naval base in Sudan, that would provide, for example, logistics route to deliver weapons, personnel, training into East Africa, which it could then use to, through the Red Sea corridor in Eastern Mediterranean, develop that logistics corridor and the transportation route to move people, equipment, and funds in and out of Lebanon, Gaza, Yemen, to retain its control of the Red Sea Basin corridor and these groups. So again, the Quds Force it's around, it's still active, it's certainly planning for the next generation of conflicts. And I think we need to go back again to your first question, which is if you're in the Trump administration, your goals have to be with the talks with Iran, you cannot provide sanctions relief to Iran if it repeats the weaknesses of the 2015 deal. When President Trump withdrew from the 2015 deal, one of the primary reasons was a phrase in the first paragraph of the 2015 deal. The 2015 deal had a phrase in the first paragraph that said it was the expectation of all the parties that the deal would contribute to regional peace. Well, whatever your views are on the nuclear aspects of the deal, the funds that Iran gave to Hezbollah, Hamas, et cetera, certainly didn't do that. And so for that reason, the Trump administration must make sure it prevents that process from repeating itself.
Final question, and if you answer it briefly, U.S. policy towards Iran is shaping by two competing schools of thought here in Washington, D.C. In one end of the spectrum, we have some isolationist voice from J.D. Vance, Musk, reluctance to foreign entanglements, and the other side, we have Marco Rubio, we have Waltz, that they are advocating for maximum pressure on Iran. I just wanted to very briefly mention for us how this internal dynamic in the Washington would affect or influence U.S. policy towards Iran.
Washington has a lot of conversations, a lot of noise. It's a good thing. We're a democracy. We have debate. Watch things in the region. We're about to put 2 aircraft carrier task forces in the region. There are 6 B-2 bombers in the region. That is the most powerful technological military force in the history of the planet. We are working with allies and we're pushing diplomacy. That is U.S. policy in action, and you're seeing the direction of where the Trump administration is going.
Thank you so much, Mr. Roule, for being with us today.
My pleasure.